Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here this evening. My name is Holly Brand, and I'm going to be facilitating our webinar this evening. Before we get started, I do just have a few quick reminders. Because this is a webinar, your camera, microphones, and chat are all going to be disabled. If you have any questions about the presentation today, please use the Q&A feature. It's going to be located on the bottom of your screen in Zoom. It looks like two little chat bubbles. We will answer questions at the end of the presentation, but you can type your questions in at any time during the presentation. If you want to provide comment about the proposed Mariculture site, you must email those to our Oyster Mariculture email address, which is oyster.mariculture@tpwd.texas.gov. We will not be taking comments over Zoom tonight. That email address will also be forwarded to you in a follow-up email tomorrow, and it will be shown on the screen later during the presentation as well. That follow-up email that I just mentioned will also have a link to our Oyster Mariculture website on the Parks and Wildlife site, along with a link to our YouTube channel where you will be able to view a recording of this webinar and the others that we have done so far. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to our presenter for the evening, Lindsay.
All right. Thank you, Holly. Tonight we are here for a public hearing for a proposed site for N-0003, a nursery hatchery facility in the Matagorda Bay system. The purpose of this public hearing is to provide information on the proposed cultivated oyster mariculture. Throughout the presentation, you'll probably hear me shorten that and use the acronym CALM for cultivated oyster mariculture, a nursery hatchery facility in the Matagorda Bay system and specifically in the Tres Palacios Bay. We'll answer any questions on this proposed facility at the end of my presentation. There will be time for you to send messages in the chat. And then we will also give instructions on how to submit public comment. Some brief background. TPWD permits the activity of cultivated oyster mariculture at either grow-out sites, often referred to as farms, or nursery hatchery facilities. If it is in the bay, that's off-bottom mariculture. So cages, bags, all the gear has to be floating, not resting on the bottom. Applicants nominate their own sites and conduct a natural resource survey. And the permit from TPWD is a 10-year term. This only applies to Eastern oyster and from Texas broodstock. An annual fee is paid each year based on the size of the facility. Before a final permit is issued, the applicants must also get authorizations from other agencies such as the Texas General Land Office, Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and the U.S. Coast Guard. There is an active use criteria for our grow-out sites so that they are actively using their site and stocking. Year-round harvest is allowed, but those must comply with all Texas Department of State Health and Service regulations. More specific about this proposed site, it's an oyster nursery hatchery facility, again, located in Tres Palacios Bay in the town of Palacios. In public waters, it's 3.98 acres, and in private property, it's 9.02 acres. And this is adjacent to existing permitted site, nursery hatchery permitted site N-0002. So right next to that. Vicinity map, again, in Matagorda County, in Tres Palacios Bay. And here's an overview of the location of the site. The already permitted site N-002 lies right here next to this. So this is, in some ways, it's an extension of that site that does require two different permits because we cannot amend the size of a permit. You just have to have an additional permit with all the other regulations that you have to go through. Here's a proposed map of the site. So in the light blue shading area, that is the proposed permitted area that's on private land. And in the red area is the proposed permitted area. And while the applicants do own, have the deed to the bay bottom in this area, the water column is still considered public water. And again, the already permitted site N-0002 from the same applicants covers this area over here, this private land area, and the marina location. For their proposed operations plan, the water will be pumped out of the marina area of the adjoining N-002. So this is the same pump already approved from the previous permit. The pipes coming off that pump will split off to the two different buildings and facility locations. There will also be a screen over the intake with secondary and tertiary filtration of that water as needed. On private land, there will be the micro nursery, spawning areas, and quarantine structure. The seawater used in those structures will drain to an existing storm drain. Again, this is the same storm drain that N-002 uses. The seawater exiting from the buildings on the proposed site will exit after going through Oyster systems, but none of that water will be chemically treated. It may have gone through filtration and UV sterilization, but no chemical treatments. If quarantine is needed of that site, the seawater will be chlorinated and properly treated with dechlorination or settling prior to disposal. And there will be separate drains for sanitary sewage system for domestic water. So again, looking at this site, the proposed areas for the buildings are here. And this diagram shows how the existing intake is located down here with this green dot, and the pipe will come up while the existing intake goes to a building that this is an older map that doesn't show the buildings that are there. The piping will split off and come to this building, and then after this goes through these buildings, it will exit to an existing storm drain here that empties onto a concrete apron into the bay. So that's the on-land portions. Now, the public water portion, because that is private on land, we don't go into more detail of the inside workings of that facility for the public meeting, but we will focus on what will be in public waters, which will be their nursery and broodstock holding area down in this lower corner of this other marina area. And looking at the different systems that they may have in there, proposed using the floating cage system, where again the material, the ropes and anchors for these will be on the bulkheads and not drain onto the bottom. So floating cages, you have floats on top of the water, the cage down in, and the oysters are contained within bags in this cage system. There is a drying position where they are flipped, where the pontoons are in the water and the oysters are, and the cage is above water that can be used as a desiccation for fouling control for algae and other organisms. The next proposed gear to have are a floating flip cage system, sometimes called a floating long line, floating basket. So these are much smaller than the cages. They're individual smaller cages. Instead of a larger cage that is, say, 1 meter by 2 meters that has a pair of bags, each of these floating cages or baskets are about 1.5 feet in diameter, hexagonal, and they have individual floats on the top, and they can be flipped along the line. And the last proposed equipment is a FLUPSY, or the floating upweller system, which would be again anchored to the bulkheads where smaller oysters are within baskets, and this is more of like a dock that somebody, not so much a dock, but a structure that somebody could walk out on and flip up different the lids to these different containers that would hold smaller oysters. As I've mentioned before, this is an expansion of the facilities and the location of N-0002. That location is owned by Palacios Marine Agriculture Research, Inc. And this is an expansion of that same applicants. And the area that will be in public waters are the nursery and broodstock holding in the marina area. Broodstock and disease testing coming in, any oyster seed, if they were to receive seed, again, that seed has to be from Texas broodstock, but could have been from another hatchery. But if it's brought in from out of state, it will be disease tested before allowing for import, as all oysters in mariculture brought in from out of state will be disease tested. Oysters brought in from other Texas Bay systems and region, they are subject to disease testing prior to being brought in the facility. TPDWD reserves the right to require that disease testing, and within any broodstock or seed coming in, they have a detailed plan of how those oysters will be washed, dipped, and decontaminated prior to integrating into their facility and bringing into their facility. They currently only plan to have oysters and broodstock from the northern genetic region. If they do in the future want to bring in oysters from out of the region, out of a different genetic region, then they would submit a permit amendment, and there'd be appropriate changes to water discharge to prevent the escapement of genetics from, say, the southern region of the area of oysters in Texas. For the natural resource survey, the samples taken for the previously permitted N-0002 were within the same time limit that could be reused for this permit before having to redo that. The samples were collected with a PVC sediment sampler. There were a total of 420 samples. Sample composition was mud or mud and shell hash. Here's an example picture of one of those samples, and then this layout shows where the natural resource survey was done, and the depth ranged from 5 to 8 feet in this location. So the next steps, after this, public comment is open to receive public comment until October 2nd. And to consider public comment, please submit to oyster.mariculture@tpwd.texas.gov. After public comment is submitted, and if it needs to be considered or any changes, a conditional permit will be issued. They may not begin mariculture activity until they have their final permit. So with that conditional, then they take their application and secure the authorizations from other state and federal agencies. Once those authorizations have been secured, then a final permit can be issued after first year's annual fee is received, and then mariculture activity can begin. So at this point, we will open it for any questions. And we'll just take a few minutes to see if there are any questions. And again, you should see a Q&A button down at the bottom of your screen. You click on that, and you can type in a question and submit it. So we'll just give you a few minutes if there are any questions. Again, questions about this proposed site, and any comments submitted here are not considered public comment. If you have any comments, then you would submit that through the email address that's on your screen. So we'll just pause here and give you a few minutes if you have any questions. Okay, we have a question. The question says, the study area shown is outside the site boundaries. Can you tell us more about how this will affect the bay, specifically shrimping, boating, and swimming? Let me go back a few slides to the actual map here. So I realize that on this screen, where I had a larger, this was just kind of a, I put up an estimate of the site area. This does not encompass all of the actual proposed location. The actual proposed location is here. So this again on blue is in private property. The red is within marine waters within a marina. So as far as swimming, there should not be in those waters. I wouldn't imagine there's a lot of swimming within the water column here or shrimping. When gear is in the water, while the water column is public, any gear itself is considered private. So if you were to navigate into the public water column, you just could not actually touch the gear there. I hope that answered your question. This area is, again, since this is private property, the bulkhead is around here, is considered part of a private marina, but I don't think any shrimping or boating would go on there. I'm not sure about how much swimming goes on in the area. Oh, where the samples were taken from. I'm sorry. Yes. So let me get to where. So the samples for the natural resource survey were taken out in the bay because of where the water drainage line. So the water drains out here. So we had the natural resource survey actually taken out in the bay to make sure there were not any established oyster reefs in this area, that if for some reason a small oyster got out of here, settlement there, or that it would impact any drainage, would impact any sort of seagrass beds or any of that. So yes, that can be confusing. So that's why the natural resource survey is out here. So it's surrounding, and even with our grow out facilities, while there's the core site, we have the natural resource survey, not just in that site, but in a 200 to 500 meter buffer around that site. So this here is just where they did their samples, and what we were looking for is if there were any natural resources, specifically seagrass or oyster reef, that may particularly be impacted by where the water drains here. Yes, so this area, and the follow-up was, this area, it will still be usable for boating and fishing and shrimping. Yes, this area, there's not going to be any gear or anything out in this area. All their gear will be contained within their sited location within this marina, not out here into the public water. That was just where they got samples for the natural resource survey. Next question is, have there been any studies on how these new oyster hatcheries will impact the existing bird habitats in the surrounding area? For hatcheries, there have been studies, and especially in other states where mariculture has been established for many years, on birds. We do, especially with our grow out sites, require a 2,000-foot buffer from active bird rookeries. One, so that any sort of boating traffic would not be disturbing those rookeries, and then also for the human health factor, that birds aren't pooping in the water and on the oysters growing out for consumption. With the oyster nurseries and hatcheries, most of that work is actually done in existing buildings. The setting of the priming the broodstock, setting of spat, and when they're very small, the gear that's in the water mainly is floating below the water. Sometimes birds do come and roost on that, and then there are specific approved bird deterrents, usually are like owl decoys, flags that are waving. So I'm trying to think. There's spinners that can spin around. So there's specifically approved bird deterrents that are approved by us, and then also that's gone through the U.S. Fish and Wildlife and National Marine Fisheries for their safety for entanglements for birds. Okay, next question is, have there been any employment studies that determine how many workers this type of hatchery will require, or will the local oyster farmers be included in this effort? I'm not sure about specific studies on how many workers. These type of nursery hatcheries usually are not as labor intensive or as large as, you would say, like local other types of aquaculture, such as shrimp and redfish. So I do not know, it's not part of their operations plan is different from their business plan. I'm not sure exactly how many employees they intend to hire for this. Generally, you're probably, I would think, 3 to 5, just kind of depends on as they scale up, as what kind of efforts they will need. For our local oyster farmers working with the hatchery, that would again be up to their own business plan, whether they include the local oyster farmers helping them in the nursery hatchery effort. But they do sell the oyster seed, does go to our local farmers, oyster farmers, and in general, they are taken into account, especially when they're planning for a year, on how many cohorts or oyster seed broodstock to produce and how many settings. So the oyster farmers are taken into account, and they do put in their oysters or their orders for the oyster seed. Okay, it doesn't look like we have any more questions right now. Again, if you want to submit public comment, please use on your screen the oyster.mariculture@tpwd.texas.gov email to send in that public comment. Also, if there is any questions that you think of later after this public meeting, then you can also email that, and we can answer any questions there. So I will now hand it over to Holly to give some final reminders.
Yeah, thank you, Lindsay. Thank you all again for attending this evening, and thank you for all the great questions. Like I said earlier, you all will be receiving a follow-up email from Zoom with a link to our YouTube channel, where you will be able to view a recording of this webinar, along with a link to our Oyster Mariculture website, and that Oyster Mariculture email address, where you can contact us for any questions, or if you have public comment that you would like to provide for this particular mariculture site. So with that, we're going to go ahead and wrap it up. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us. Thank you, Lindsay, Karen, and Leslie, for being on the webinar as well. And we will see you all next time. Thank you.